In the early years of the 20th century, Cuba appeared, at least from a distance, to be a nation of promise. The island sat only 90 miles from the coast of the United States. Havana glittered with casinos, grand hotels, American automobiles, and tropical nightlife. Sugar exports brought enormous wealth. Tourists arrived in growing numbers. To outsiders, Cuba often looked prosperous, modern, and stable. But beneath that image lay a very different reality. Welcome to History Unpacked. If you enjoy the content, consider subscribing. We post every week and we welcome any feedback. In today's episode, we will be talking about the Cuban Revolution, and this will be part one of a two-part series. Large parts of Cuba's economy were controlled by foreign companies, especially from the US. Sugar plantations dominated much of the countryside. Seasonal laborers worked only part of the year and often endured months of unemployment between harvests. In many rural communities, there was little access to electricity, healthcare, or proper education. Political corruption was deeply entrenched. Elections were manipulated, governments unstable, and wealthy interests held enormous influence behind the scenes. By the middle of the century, resentment had begun to spread. Many Cubans believed that their country was becoming dependent on foreign power and ruled by corrupt elites. Within that growing dissatisfaction, the foundations of revolution slowly emerged. The story of the Cuban Revolution did not begin with gunfire in the mountains. It actually began years earlier, in failed governments, widening inequality, student unrest, gang violence, and the ambitions of one man who believed Cuba could be remade entirely. That man was Fidel Castro. After Spain's defeat in the Spanish-American War of 1898, Cuba remained under US military occupation until formally becoming independent in 1902. Yet independence came with limitations. The United States retained enormous influence over the island's economy and political affairs. American companies invested heavily in Cuban sugar, railroads, utilities, banks, and tourism. To many Cuban nationalists, the country's independence felt incomplete. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, Cuba drifted repeatedly between weak democratic governments and authoritarian rule. Corruption became routine. Political patronage, bribery, and electoral manipulation shaped much of public life. One figure emerged repeatedly during this unstable period: Batista. Batista first rose to prominence during the 1933 Revolt of the Sergeants. Originally a military officer from a modest background, he rapidly became the dominant figure within Cuba's armed forces. Though he initially ruled indirectly through a series of presidents, Batista soon became the most powerful man in Cuban politics. For a period, Batista enjoyed genuine support. During the 1940s, Cuba adopted a relatively progressive constitution, and Batista himself won election legally in 1940. Yet corruption remained widespread, and after he left office, instability returned once again. Meanwhile, Havana was undergoing its own transformation. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, Havana had become internationally famous for gambling, nightlife, and luxury tourism. Wealthy American visitors arrived in large numbers. American organized crime figures, including Meyer Lansky, became heavily involved in Havana's casino and hotel industries. To tourists, the city appeared glamorous and modern, but for many ordinary Cubans, the reality remained very different. Outside the wealthy districts, poverty persisted across much of the island. Rural workers struggled through cycles of seasonal unemployment. Many children lacked proper schooling. Infrastructure in parts of the countryside remained extremely poor. While Cuba's economy performed relatively well compared to many Latin American nations, statistically, wealth remained unevenly distributed. These contrasts became increasingly difficult to ignore. University students, labor activists, intellectuals, and nationalists condemned what they viewed as corruption, foreign influence, and overall moral decay. Political violence intensified during the periods as rival factions fought openly in the streets. Assassinations and bombings became increasingly common. Public faith in democratic politics steadily weakened. Then, in 1952, Batista returned. On March the 10th, 1952, only months before scheduled national elections, Batista seized power in a military coup. The elections were cancelled. Much of the constitution was suspended. Batista justified the coup by claiming Cuba faced disorder and instability, but many saw it as a straightforward seizure of power. The United States quickly recognized Batista's government. At first, many Cubans responded with resignation rather than outrage. Military coups were not unusual in Latin America during this era. Yet Batista's regime soon revealed an increasingly authoritarian character. Opposition groups were suppressed, journalists were censored, critics were harassed, imprisoned, or killed, corruption deepened further. At the same time, Batista strengthened relationships with wealthy elites, foreign investors, and casino interests tied to Havana's expanding tourism industry. For some young Cubans, peaceful reform now appeared impossible. One of them was a young lawyer named Fidel Castro. Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz was born in 1926 near Biran in eastern Cuba. His father was a relatively wealthy landowner of Spanish origin, meaning Castro himself did not emerge from poverty despite later revolutionary mythology. He received a Jesuit education and quickly developed a reputation for intelligence, ambition, and fierce self-confidence. At the University of Havana, Castro studied law and became deeply involved in student politics. The atmosphere was turbulent and often violent. Armed gangs connected to political factions operated openly across the university environment. During these years, Castro developed strong nationalist and anti-corruption views. He condemned inequality, political dishonesty, and foreign influence over Cuba. Though later associated entirely with communism, Castro in these early years publicly emphasized nationalism and social reform more than Marxist ideology. When Batista seized power in 1952, Castro concluded that legal opposition would achieve nothing. He began planning armed resistance. On July the 26th, 1953, Fidel Castro and roughly 150 rebels launched an attack on the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba. The plan was ambitious but poorly executed. Castro hoped to seize weapons, trigger a wider uprising, and ignite revolution across Cuba. Instead, confusion quickly overtook the operation. Communication failed, several rebel groups became lost, government troops responded rapidly. The assault collapsed within hours. Many rebels were killed during the fighting, others were captured and tortured afterward. Batista's forces carried out brutal reprisals in the days following the attack. Some prisoners were executed extrajudicially, their deaths falsely presented as combat casualties. Fidel Castro himself was captured several days later. At first glance, the revolutionary movement appeared finished before it truly began. Yet the Moncada attack became historically significant for another reason. Castro's trial transformed him into a national figure. During his trial, Castro delivered a lengthy political defense attacking Batista's government and outlining his vision for Cuba. The speech, later reconstructed and distributed under the title History Will Absolve Me, became enormously influential. Castro condemned dictatorship, corruption, inequality, and foreign economic domination. He called for land reforms, expanded education, workers' rights, and restoration of a constitutional government. Copies of the speech circulated secretly throughout Cuba and helped build Castro's reputation among students and opposition groups. Batista had intended to destroy a small rebel movement. Instead, he unintentionally gave its leader national attention. Castro was sentenced to prison, but he would not remain there long. In May 1955, facing increasingly political pressure and hoping to improve his public image, Batista granted amnesty to many political prisoners, including Fidel Castro and his brother Raul Castro. The decision would prove disastrous for the regime. After his release, Fidel left Cuba for Mexico, where he reorganized the revolutionary movement. It became known as the 26th of July movement, named after the failed Moncada attack. In Mexico, Castro met several figures who would later become central to the revolution. One of them was an Argentine doctor named Ernesto Che Guevara. Che Guevara had traveled widely across Latin America during his youth. Witnessing poverty, exploitation, and political repression radicalized him deeply. By the time he met Fidel Castro in Mexico, Guevara was already believed armed revolution was necessary throughout Latin America. The two men quickly formed a close political alliance. Although Castro remained focused primarily on Cuba, both men believed existing political system serves elite and foreign interests rather than ordinary citizens. Together, they began preparing for guerrilla warfare. Training conditions in Mexico were far from ideal. Weapons were limited, many recruits lacked military experience. Mexican authorities briefly arrested several members of the group before eventually releasing them. Still, preparations continued. Then, in late 1956, the revolutionaries boarded a small yacht called the Granma. The Granma was dangerously overcrowded. Originally designed for far fewer passengers, the yacht carried 82 revolutionaries across rough seas from Mexico towards Cuba. Conditions aboard quickly deteriorated, supplies ran low, seasickness spread through the cramped vessel. The landing itself rapidly descended into disaster. The rebels arrived later than expected on December 2nd, 1956. Batista's forces had already been alerted. Soon after reaching eastern Cuba, government troops attacked. The revolutionary force was nearly destroyed. Many fighters were killed or captured, others scattered through swamps and forests. At one stage, fewer than 20 rebels remained together. Once again, the revolution appeared close to complete failure, yet survival itself became a turning point. The surviving rebels escaped into the Sierra Maestra mountains of eastern Cuba. There, Fidel Castro slowly rebuilt the movement through guerrilla warfare. The mountains provided protection from Batista's army, which struggled to operate effectively in difficult terrain. Castro's fighters relied on ambushes, mobility propaganda, and local support rather than conventional military strength. At first, the movement remained extremely small, yet Batista made several critical mistakes that gradually strengthened the rebels instead of destroying them. Government troops often treated rural populations brutally, suspecting peasants of assisting the guerrillas. Villages were raided, civilians were beaten, arrested, and sometimes killed. Corruption and poor discipline weakened military morale. Meanwhile, Castro carefully cultivated his public image. Foreign journalists visited the Sierra Maestra and interviewed the rebels. One particularly important interview with New York Times journalist Herbert Matthews in 1957 convinced many observers internationally that Castro remained alive and commanded a growing revolutionary force. The psychological impact was enormous. Batista had attempted to portray the rebels as defeated. Instead, international attention increasingly focused on the insurgency. Support for the revolution slowly expanded. By 1957 and 1958, opposition to Batista extended far beyond Castro's guerrillas. Students organized protests in the cities, labor strikes disrupted industries, underground groups carried out sabotage operations and assassinations. Many Cubans who were out for ideological revolutionaries nevertheless viewed Batista as corrupt, violent, and increasingly illegitimate. The regime responded with harsher repression. Police torture became widespread. Suspected dissidents disappeared. Military campaigns against rebels intensified, yet the violence often pushed more people towards opposition. Within the mountains, Castro also demonstrated growing political skill. Discipline among rebel fighters was generally stronger than in many rival groups. Literacy and political education were promoted inside revolutionary camps. Promises of land reforms attracted support from peasants. Rebel radio broadcasts spread revolutionary propaganda across the island. At the same time, divisions within the opposition remained significant. Some anti-Batista groups supported liberal democracy rather than socialism. Others distrusted Castro personally. Few people at this stage fully understood what type of government might emerge if the revolution succeeded. Even the United States remained uncertain. Washington initially continued supporting Batista, but growing concerns over corruption, repression, and military failure gradually weakened American confidence in the regime. Batista was becoming increasingly isolated. By 1958, the Cuban Revolution had evolved from a small insurgency into a national crisis. Batista launched a major military offensive involving roughly 10,000 government troops against Castro forces in the mountains. On paper, the government should have crushed the guerrillas decisively. Instead, the offensive failed. Poor morale, corruption, weak leadership, and difficult terrain undermined Batista's army. Rebel fighters used ambush tactics effectively and steadily gained confidence. Elsewhere across Cuba, unrest spread further. Economic instability worsened. Public confidence in the government continued collapsing. Even some military officers began doubting Batista's leadership. Then came the rebel counteroffensive. Che Guevara and Camilo Cuevas led guerrilla columns westward across Cuba. Rebel victories multiplied. Railways were sabotaged, government positions collapsed with surprising speed. In December 1958, Guevara captured the strategic city of Santa Clara after the rebel forces derailed an armored train carrying government troops and military supplies. The symbolic effect was devastating. Batista now understood the situation was hopeless. In the early hours of January the 4th, 1959, Batista fled Cuba, eventually arriving in the Dominican Republic. The revolution had won, but the far more complicated struggle deciding what revolutionary Cuba would become was only beginning. And that struggle would transform not only Cuba itself, but the entire Cold War world. Join us in part 2, where we talk about how Castro shaped the country into a battleground for two superpowers.